Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 15th of September. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather service forecast information, warnings, watches, and advisories included, and tips on how to stay safe during the fall and winter weather that is certainly coming into Alaska now. Weather.gov/Alaska or the weather info line at 800-472-0391. You can find us during the day on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. In the afternoon, of course, you'll get your daily afternoon map briefings, and you'll see those same pictures here. So kind of a sneak peek at where we're going with the weather picture all the way around Alaska every single day, 365 days a year. Here is a look at our first chart there. That's Mr. Sean, if you could give us a little bit of a push there, that would be great. It looks like we're talking about a lot of rain across the Gulf of Alaska. As a result of that, there's pockets of flooding, probably, well, let's not say flooding just yet, but it rises on some of the local creeks and streams. And flooding wouldn't be a stretch there in the coming days if this amount of rain continues, especially around the south central region. Around Anchorage, just in one spot in particular, if you've been on the west side of town or across parts of the Kenai Peninsula, it has rained pretty much all day long. We've had about 3/4 of an inch of rain around the Anchorage area, especially on the west side there, and many other locations across the Matanuska and Susitna Valley have seen similar circumstances throughout the day. Now, the rainy weather is going to continue around the Gulf of Alaska for the foreseeable future, which in our show land here is about 2 days or so. And across northern parts of southeast, you can see the redder areas that are indicating as much as 2 to 3 inches of rainfall. This again is showing that a lot of that wet weather is coming up in south central and a lot of it's moving over into northern parts of southeast, and some of that is sloshing northward into the interior where it has been rainy, wet, and even snowy in some parts of the interior. So as far as the cold and the snow goes, we have a winter weather advisory that's in effect for some parts of the south-facing slopes of the eastern Brooks Range till about 6 o'clock tomorrow. Now we're still watching for cold and snowy weather that could impact travel across some areas in the northern range there. It looks like that will continue with the cold that's in place across the coastal plain. The temperatures today were hovering at or just below freezing across the north slope, and many locations were not a whole lot warmer. But that rain and snow line has been dropping slowly down the mountains, and that trend is going to continue for many locations across the interior and south central as we go in toward the end of the week. Now, it doesn't look like many places across south central are going to be dealing with any accumulating snow anytime soon, but that trend is certainly coming a little bit more apparent with the colder weather that's dropping in further and further south down the western coast. You can see slugs of moisture moving across the Gulf of Alaska. Each one of these waves working into southeast brings a dose of rainfall. Some of that, again, upwards of an inch or so across some of the higher terrain, especially northern parts of southeast, seeing just a very wet period, and this is looking back toward yesterday. You can see that frontal boundary working through. Each one of these waves has several other impulses along it and reinforces that lift. Another one of these is coming into south and western parts of Alaska as we head into tomorrow. That could bring showers and thunderstorms into places like Bristol Bay. So a little bit more of an energetic fall-like system moving into south and eastern parts of the Bering and eventually into the Gulf of Alaska. Here's a look at the current surface map. Low pressure sitting across the northern parts of the Gulf at 998 millibars. Again, this has kept rain across a large part of south central really for most of the day, especially around Cook Inlet. Now for northern parts of southeast, another wave sitting just offshore is sloshing up rainfall across many of the coastal areas, especially the northern half. We saw some pockets of rainfall across the interior today, mainly across the western and south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range, and we're again watching for that winter weather advisory to continue across the eastern parts of the south-facing slopes, including places like Arctic Village throughout the rest of tonight. On the north slope, some areas of light snow there, generally around AKwx and eastward toward Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse, and another wave of low pressure moving off of Russia at 1,000 2 millibars is showing signs of dropping to the east and southeast with one front already up against the Aleutians. This will die out. The next wave will replace it, and that too will die out, but each one is a succession of the very active pattern that continues across all of our state. Now, as we head into tonight, low pressure sitting across the northern Gulf at 997 millibars is pushing in more moderate to occasionally heavy rainfall across southeast and across south central Alaska. If you don't have rain across the southern third of Alaska, chances are you're going to be clouded in across southwest, periods of rainfall and maybe even a storm as we head into tomorrow. The cooler air is dropping southward. That wave of cool air will start to mix up a little bit more, so we're going to change this into a trough of low pressure. Not as much of a big temperature change as it will be just an area of lift in the atmosphere that allows those clouds to build up a little bit more and squeeze out a little bit more rain once it passes through. Now, across the areas just north of the Yukon, we're looking at a cool enough weather for a little bit of snow to fall, mainly across the higher terrain there, and the same goes for areas up the Haul Road. Watch for fog across the Arctic coast, a better chance for fog more so than any precipitation. For southeast, it looks like rain for you with a wave of low pressure across the eastern Gulf, and then we'll see some pockets of drier weather rotating around this overall circulation that's covering up the southern half of Alaska, and that is a dominant area of low pressure in the upper atmosphere, and you'll see that on the upper air charts here in just a little bit with the jet stream, the 9 and the 3,000 foot aviation levels. At Thursday, we're looking at low pressure just east of Northway, about 992 millibars there, a little bit stronger low across Cook Inlet, and again, that's going to keep rain falling across the Kenai and most parts of southwestern Alaska. A lot of this will start to shift eastward just a little bit more on Friday and maybe on Saturday, so there is some improvements to be seen perhaps, but a lot of this is also going to be stuck in place, so we're going to have a lot of moisture that's not really moving out of the weather picture anytime soon. Now, a little bit further south across the central and southern Gulf, we've got this next wave of low pressure coming up out of the North Pacific. As this moves into that very wet air already gathered out ahead of it, that should reinforce very wet weather for southeast. So moderate to heavy rainfall certainly in your future as we head into Thursday and Friday, it looks like. Up north, cold enough weather for the North Slope for pockets of snow showers to continue there. More fog across the Arctic coast, but there should be some drier weather, especially from Wainwright all the way into Kotzebue Sound and maybe as far south as Nome. So you might catch a little bit of a break there as you head into Wednesday night and Thursday. The west coast looks breezy, wet and cool with showers continuing for the central and eastern chain and fog a little bit further out for the western chain there. Watch for the fog to continue for areas around the Pribilofs too as we head toward Thursday and Friday. It is September, of course. Here's a look at the temperature now for southeast. Most areas this afternoon made it back into the lower to mid 50s. Prince William Sound saw some cooler weather around Valdez, only 46 today. Lower 50s from Kenai southward toward Homer and 51 in Seward, 46 in Anchorage late today. Mid 40s for the Susitna Valley and westward toward Rainy Pass, 46 around Fairbanks, 47 for Eagle today, 43 in Fort Yukon with temps up north. In the lower 30s for most of the Arctic coast, Barrow and Atkasuk both at 31. The AKwx Pass was showing 28, one of the colder spots in the state this afternoon. Mid 40s for most of Kotzebue Sound, and you can see Nome was right there at 46 as well. Unalakleet showed 43, McGrath at 48 with Galena at 41. Bethel had 45, Nunivak Island right at 50 degrees, a little bit milder if you could get out from underneath the rainfall, and the lower 50s extended all the way out into the Alaska Peninsula with Kodiak showing 58 today. Sandpoint was 55, Adak and Atka were both in the mid-50s with St. Paul at 50 degrees at 48 in Shemya. Overnight low temperatures will remain mild for southwest and the Aleutians, while southeast is a little bit cooler in the mid-40s. South Central is expecting low temperatures closer to the 40-degree mark. Anchorage 43, Talkeetna about 38 degrees, even cooler in Fairbanks at 36 with Eagle at 35. 25 for AKwx Pass again, and areas along the Brooks Range will be cold enough for some snow. The Arctic coast looking at temperatures that are just below freezing now. 32 around Kaktovik with a high there of only 33, only 32 in Barrow tomorrow afternoon, with Nome showing 44, Kotzebue about 40 degrees, upper 40s to lower 50s for Bristol Bay and most of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, 56 in Kodiak, lower 50s for the Alaska Peninsula and the Chain, with most of southeastern Alaska in the lower 50s. Prince William Sound holding close to 50 degrees, and Gulkana should be close to 50 tomorrow afternoon as well. Now, flying weather shows MVFR conditions continuing for most of the northern coastal plain and the Arctic coast, generally east of Point Barrow toward Kaktovik, through the Bering Strait, but many areas along the west coast will see VFR conditions by tomorrow afternoon. Watch for IFR from Kiska eastward toward Adak and Atka and almost toward Dutch Harbor, Unalaska, but things may improve the further east you go. And south of Sitkinak, look for IFR conditions there. Most of the Gulf will be under MVFR, with some improvement in visibility through the central and southern parts of southeast as the day goes on, but you'll probably start out with worse conditions in the morning. AKwx Pass is expected to turn over toward IFR as the day goes on, starting at MVFR. Same goes for Adigan Pass tomorrow. Look for IFR conditions to develop. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, we expect to see VFR conditions as we go through your Wednesday. And Rainy Pass expected to hold at MVFR through most of the day. Same goes for Windy Pass. Marginal conditions are expected there. Isabel Pass should lean over toward IFR throughout the day. Not a whole lot of wind, but just poor visibility there, especially with rain continuing to move through. Antasta Pass, we expect to see marginal conditions developing throughout the day thanks to the rainfall. And Tanita Pass, we expect to see MVFR throughout most of your Wednesday. Portage Pass may see some improvements as the afternoon goes on, but do expect a wet day in Prince William Sound, of course. And Chilcoot and White Pass, we expect to see that holding at MVFR through most of your Wednesday. The freezing levels show that cold air is certainly winning over the North Slope, but it hasn't made a huge impact the further south you go, at least at the surface level just yet. It's pretty shallow stuff. But in the upper atmosphere, you can see colder air is slipping southward down the west coast to Bristol Bay, where levels are as cool as 6,000 feet there. You can see as low as 4,000 feet around the Wrangell-St. Elias region, and most of southeast has freezing levels at or just below that 6,000 foot level. South central between 4 and about 5,000 feet, with most of the Aleutians between 8 and 10. As we look at icing potential, there's certainly plenty of moisture to be had, but you still have to go a little bit higher up there to get into the better chance for rime icing. Light to isolated moderates possible across a large part of the middle Tanana Valley and down into the upper Kuskokwim and southwest, as well as most of the Gulf Coast around into southeast, but those levels are above 8 to 9,000 feet and above 6,000 feet for the interior. So again, most of your icing is still fairly high up there. The jet stream shows our dominant weather pattern right now, and it is this sliding feature of cooler air dropping southward, a little bit of a bump and then another drop into southeast. Each one of these waves represents another little help of storm energy to kind of get that moisture going, get those clouds building, and get that cold air dropping southward behind it. So this is a progressive weather pattern and a very active weather pattern for Alaska. At 9,000 feet, it doesn't take a weather genius to tell you what's going on here, but I will just in case. See what I did there? Low pressure across the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta showing that the cold air is dropping in on the west side. We're energizing most of the Gulf of Alaska with warm and wet air and then running that right into southeastern Alaska. Now most of the interior is kind of getting the leftovers here. Wind speeds are light, wind speeds are stronger out across the Alaska Peninsula at 40 to 50 knots. Now across the North Slope, we have a little bit more of an onshore flow with a northeasterly wind about 20 to 30 knots. A south and westerly flow becomes a little bit more of a west and northwesterly wind across the Bristol Bay region, and southerlies weaken as they move northward into the Chugach. 15 knots there closer to the coast, but 30 to 40 knots right over Kodiak Island, and southwesterlies coming in to southeast between 10 and 20 knots there, with northerlies continuing out across the western chain. So what about turbulence? Well, the wind's not as much of a problem right now with our weather pattern as the visibility and the icing potential, which is slowly dropping there. You can see light to isolated moderate risk across the north and western Chukchi coast, across the western tip of the Seward Peninsula, and right on the coastal areas of the YK Delta, Nunivak Island to the Alaska Peninsula, and areas around the Barrens, especially east of the Barren Islands below 4,000 feet, and just across the Dixon entrance there in the central and western chain. Most areas below 4,000 feet for a little bit of light chop. That's a look at your aviation forecast. In just a few minutes, we'll be back with your marine weather and a look at the updated sea ice edge. We have some sea ice news to tell you about. Stay tuned.
Hi, I'm Craig Goodrich, Fire Marshal for the state of Alaska. I'd like to talk to you before we get started with the upcoming video to tell you that conditions are extremely dry right now in the state. There have been a number of forest fires so far. We want to avoid another disastrous year like we had in 1996 at the Miller's Reach fire. The video that is upcoming will have a variety of useful information, simple points that you can employ to help defend your home from the devastating effects of wildland forest fire. If at the end of this video you have questions, please feel free to contact your local fire department or the office of the State Fire Marshal.
I'm Jim Smalley of the National Fire Protection Association. As a homeowner living in areas where wildfires can occur, you can protect your home and preserve the environment around you by taking a few simple precautions.
First, before you buy land for a home, check with local officials to see what fire protection is available. Keep in mind that some areas are less naturally fire safe than others. For instance, during a fire, narrow canyons become natural chimneys, drawing in fire and accelerating its rate of spread. Locate your home on the most level portion. Fire spreads rapidly, even on minor slopes. If you're building a home on top of a ridge, it's also very important to build an adequate setback, at least 30 feet for a single-story home, to prevent the house from being hit directly by flames and heat moving up the sides of the ridge. Pre-construction planning shouldn't stop with the home itself. Consider that in the event of fire, firefighters need to be able to get to your site. You'll need two-way roads with parking lanes to allow fire trucks and emergency vehicles plenty of room to get in and out. And since these vehicles may have difficulty climbing steep roads, build your road with a gradient of less than 12%. Any bridges leading to your home should also be wide enough and strong enough to support firefighting vehicles. A 40,000-pound minimum is recommended, but check with fire officials about local requirements. If your site has a cul-de-sac, make sure the radius is a minimum of 45 feet, wide enough for a fire truck to turn around without having to back up. A loop or U-shaped driveway provides plenty of access for firefighting equipment and an alternate escape route for you. Be sure to mark your location with a road name and house number clearly visible from the road so firefighters can find you.
Whether you're building a new home or retrofitting an existing one, you can work with building contractors, your architect, and fire protection agencies to create a design that's both aesthetically pleasing and fire safe.
There are many people in there that have bits and pieces of information that individually need to be brought together and produce a sort of an umbrella of information that would be available to the design professions. And that's not just architects, that's planners and landscape architects.
I think that many landscape architects, as well as other design professionals, are not aware of all of the do's and don'ts of protecting structures and life within the urban wildland interface.
The best thing is cooperation from the start. You know, it's iron out the problem areas, try to work out the problem areas, identify them, and then you know, work out solutions to those problems as soon as possible.
What we asked the developer to do was present a variety of opportunities that could be exploited through the project master plan that would be adopted through our process. The applicant came back with those suggestions. He, of course, consulted with the fire protection districts.
There are lots of situations in this particular part of the country where people have built into subdivisions that really didn't have adequate planning from a fire point of view. And so we have areas that we're very concerned about putting firemen into the area to save the houses. And we really feel that if we do have a fire in some particular areas, that we may just have to let the house go, because it would be a suicide mission to put our firemen in there to protect the houses. These are houses that don't have an adequate water system. They have long, narrow driveways. They have less than 30 feet clearance around the structure. They have shake roofs, rood sides. They have big bay windows with nice trees growing up through the decks. And as far as we're concerned, these are areas that we're actually going to have to write off. We will not be able to save these houses.
Fire officials say that non-treated wood shake roofs, which catch wind-blown sparks, are the #1 cause of home losses in wildland areas. so your roof should be made of non-combustible or fire-resistant materials. Some jurisdictions may allow the use of factory-treated wood shakes, but you should check this with your local authorities.
You may think that roof sprinklers could prevent a wood shake roof from burning, but they could provide only a false sense of security.
In the event of fire, you'd need large volumes of water to really make the roof safe, and water pressure is generally at its lowest during a fire. The electricity needed to pump the water may also fail during a fire crisis. Also, the high winds which often accompany wildland fires can divert the sprinkler spray from the roof. Like the roof, exterior walls should be made of fire-resistive materials from the ground to the roof line. It also helps immensely to keep flammable vegetation, wood piles, and debris away from the walls, but we'll talk more about that later. To ensure that you don't create your own spark hazard, screen your chimneys with non-combustible wire mesh screening. Also, cover your exterior attic and underfloor vents with wire mesh no larger than 1/2 inch to prevent sparks from being drawn in and catching fire. Sparks can melt through plastic or nylon screening. And if you're building a new home, locate your under-eave vents near the roof line rather than near the wall to prevent heat or flames from being entrapped. For the same reason, the eaves themselves should be boxed or designed with minimal overhang. You should also screen under your porch or any other areas below the ground line, again to keep out sparks and flames. Where windows are concerned, thick tempered safety glass is the safest choice, especially for picture windows and sliding glass doors. It may be possible to use double pane glass instead, but you should contact your local fire officials to see what's appropriate. Again, if you're building a new home, minimize the size and number of windows on the side of the house that would likely be exposed to a fire, the downhill side, or both. Also, windows should not face trees or shrubs that are closer than 30 feet away. On the outside, protect windows and sliding glass doors with non-flammable shutters, balconies, or decks. Fire-resistant drapes add extra protection inside.
Temperatures are cooling down quite enough across the Beaufort seacoast that new ice is forming, but it's about 350 nautical miles offshore to really see any kind of very steady growth going on. I've colored in the areas of white right now that are the new sea ice, according to our sea ice experts in the Anchorage National Weather Service office. You can see that most of the ice is still well offshore. The new ice that's been forming over the last couple days is even further offshore. We still have a very thin sliver of older ice that's sitting just north and east of Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse and west of Kaktovik. But new ice is forming and the sea ice minimum is expected to have been reached at this point. So you can read more about that and the outlook for the next 5 days anytime by going to weather.gov/anchorage/ice.php. Here's a look at the weather in southeast now. For the marine areas, we're looking at winds from the south and east about 20 to 25 knots on the inside. Seas running from 4 to 5 feet, and across the outer coastline 20 knots in most areas with the exception of the region just outside of the Dixon entrance, 15 knots there. A south and southwesterly flow will continue with seas running between 6 and 7 feet for Wednesday. A little bit of a shift on Thursday with a south and southwesterly wind for the outer coast up to 25 knots in some areas. 6 to 9 foot seas are expected. Across the inside, 20 to 25 knots continue with a southeasterly wind and 4 to 5 foot seas as we head into Thursday. For South Central on Wednesday, light and variable winds are expected in the northern part of Cook Inlet with a westerly flow across the Barrens, southwesterlies in the north and western Gulf, and northerly winds inside of Prince William Sound with a 10-knot wind and 2 foot seas expected there. Look for an easterly shift as we head into Thursday. Westerlies coming across Kodiak Island at 20 to 25 knots, and northwesterlies cutting across the southern Kenai at 15 knots with a 2 foot sea inside of southern parts of Cook Inlet, 6 to 7 foot seas in the north and western Gulf. Across the Alaska Peninsula, a westerly flow inside of Bristol Bay. That's going to continue the very wet weather pattern and once again offer up an opportunity for a few thunderstorms to form, even in the marine areas tomorrow. 30-knot winds there down the coast on the Bering Sea, 30 knots with a 9-foot sea, and south and westerly winds on the Pacific side with 25 knots and 7-foot seas expected for Wednesday. Not a whole lot of a change for Thursday as far as speeds and seas go, but look for a northwesterly shift there in the southern tip of the Alaska Peninsula. 6 to 7-foot seas with 25 knots from the north and west, and 30-knot winds inside of Bristol Bay on Thursday with a 9-foot sea. For Wednesday, across the Aleutians, westerlies continue for the central and eastern chain. 5 to 7 foot seas on the Bering Sea coast, 15 to 20 knots there, and 20 knots across the Pacific side, with northerlies developing across the western chain at 15 knots with a 7 foot sea. As we get into Thursday, look for a north and westerly flow for most areas from the east to the west. Seas will run around 15 to 20 knots with 6 to 7 foot seas in most areas and 6 foot seas across the Pacific coastline. That'll be for Thursday. For the west coast, look for northerly winds from Gamble all the way out towards St. Matthew and Nunivak Island, 20 to 25 knots there, but westerlies a little bit further south as a trough of low pressure is dropping southward. This is another round of cooler air that will energize that chance for showers and maybe even thunderstorms across Bristol Bay and across some parts of the southern Bering. 7 to 8 foot seas from the Pribilofs into the Kuskokwim Bay area. As we get into Thursday, northwesterlies develop there around the Kuskokwim Bay and the Pribilofs with 20 knots there with 6 to 7 foot seas. Winds come up a little bit more from the north around St. Lawrence Island, 30 knots with 9 foot seas. We'll keep an eye on what's going on across the northern coast. The last time you had some stronger winds there, the beach was looking at some rougher sea conditions there. For Wednesday across the north slope, 15 to 20 knots across Barrow out toward Kaktovik. Look for seas to run around 4 to 5 feet. East and northeasterly winds coming down the Chukchi seacoast, 20 to 25 knots, 8 foot seas though, outside of the Kotzebue Sound region on that 25 knot wind. Those winds come up to 30 knots as we head into Thursday. 9 foot seas are expected in that region. Winds diminish just offshore of Barrow at 10 knots, and will keep an east and northeasterly flow around the Beaufort seacoast with seas running between 4 and 5 feet. Recapping tonight's weather, several waves of low pressure will work out of the Bering and across south central into the Gulf of Alaska and eventually into southeast. Leftover moisture is being sloshed up into the interior, and where that meets up with cold air, you're seeing rain mixed with snow, a very typical September pattern. Wet weather will continue for many across the west, southwest, south central, and certainly southeast as we go throughout the remainder of the week. Dry days look to be few, and cooler days look to be coming across the north with pockets of snow and a winter weather advisory for the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range until 6 o'clock tomorrow. Thanks for watching.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.